This is an interview with Robert Sollazzo for the SEC Historical Society's Virtual Museum and Archive on the history of financial regulation. Today is February 24th, 2023, and I'm Kenneth Durr. Bob, good to see you today.
How you doing, Ken?
Doing well.
Good.
I'm looking forward to our talk. I'm heading toward the end of my research process for the gallery on exams, and I'm interested to talk to you today about the broker-dealer program. But first, let's get some background. Where did you go to school?
Okay, before giving my background, Ken, I just want to thank the Historical Society for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And I also want to mention that a lot of what I'm saying today results from the work of many excellent colleagues. And unfortunately, most of them will go unnamed, but I just want to get that on the record because that they're just it's a great group that I worked with over an approximate 40-year career there. Okay, here's my background. I was a Catholic school boy, so through high school I went to various Catholic schools, but then I went to Brooklyn College where I majored in accounting. I did quite well there. Unfortunately, I graduated, I didn't have enough credits to qualify for the CPA exam, so I had to continue at night. But it was actually a very good experience and a lot cheaper than cost of schools today.
So you ended up in Chicago somehow, right? You went to work for comics?
Yes. So my first job was working for Comex Clearing Association as an accountant, and also doing computing the open interest, doing various daily functions. And it was an interesting position, but I lasted there for about a year. I was influenced to go into government by my family, a lot of government employees in my family. So eventually I landed a job with HEW, Health, Education, Welfare, in their audit group, and it was a good experience there. Unfortunately, the agency was splitting up, so I was faced with a lot of travel. Buffalo in the winter did not sound like the best experience, so started looking around.
And you found the SEC. How did you do that?
Yeah, it kind of interesting. The SEC, I just sort of walked into the personnel office. They're in the same building, federal building downtown. It was a 171 sold form. I don't know if they're still using it, but it's a form. I recently saw my handwritten application. I don't know if I would have hired me based upon my handwritten application, but yeah, submitted that, and I was called after a few weeks for an interview.
So you were called
I'd
up
just like to say that I was always attracted to the SEC because it's a highly respected government agency. Always, I saw that as sort of like the high threshold in terms of working in the federal government. But,
So were you called up to interview in New York or were you in Chicago?
yeah, it was in New York. Yeah, my whole career has been in New York City. So had an interview. I met with Marty Kupperberg, who later become my boss. Marty, he's an interesting character. He asked me basically a bunch of softball questions, nothing too difficult. I think he was very instinctive. I think he got a good sense of me from my background. He checked to see that I was breathing and I seemed reasonably healthy. And then he prepared me for the next interview. He said it was going to be very different, which it was. The next meeting was with the associate director and broker-dealer. His name was Ed Norlinger. And his interviews are legendary. Ed would get you in there and sort of almost as soon as you sit down, I would start firing questions, technical questions. What's a stock? What's a bond? Then he'd ask, some of those, fine, was answering those correctly, no problem. But then he'd start asking specific issues on federal securities laws. He slipped in one constitutional law question. I had no clue at that point. I wasn't familiar with the securities law. So I basically said, Ed, I can't answer those. I just don't have that background at this point. And which I didn't realize at the time, but I think he was checking, first whether I was getting rattled based upon those questions, and secondly, whether I was going to try to fit, which of course I wasn't. That wasn't in my nature.
That's pretty good. Was that it? You just had to get through?
Yeah, it was just two interviews. It's a little different now, as you can imagine, but it was just two interviews, and decision was made. As I said, sometimes Marty, he was very instinctive and sometimes a little impulsive, and I think he probably made the decision that I was a hire based upon my application and the fact that I seemed somewhat professional, I guess, in his mind. And it was a sort of a change going over too in the group. Um, there was a lot of folks from Wall Street at the time in the group. There's only 15 people in the group, and I think they were moving more towards a younger generation. So a changeover in examining, more college educated. Maybe a number of the new people had accounting degrees or finance degrees, which wasn't the situation in the years before I joined. Marty was and several other the managers were college educated, but some of the other folks were not, and they brought in some other experience too, which was very valuable, which is the back office and knowledge of Wall Street experience. But it was clear that they were trying to go in a new direction.
Interesting. Did you hire into market reg?
Yes. At that time, the exam program was in market reg, and truthfully, what I realized over the years is we sort of a backwater in market reg. It wasn't prominent. The rulemaking interpretive groups were much more prominent. So we probably didn't get as much of attention as we deserved. However, that allowed us to have a lot of flexibility, which I always appreciated. I thought that was a good thing. But it was sort of interesting the way we're positioned there.
What do you mean by flexibility?
At that time, I wasn't a manager, so I didn't see it firsthand, but I got the sense that a lot of the direction of the program was coming from the regional office managers. Like Marty Kupperberg in particular. There was a fellow named Tom Cam, who's also a very bright guy. Two good leaders, and they would make a lot of decision making in terms of what issues we wanted to examine, and what firms we wanted to explore. You have to realize too, Ken, that the regional office is all very different. New York, we had pretty much everything. We had the large firms, we had small firms. The firms out in San Francisco, and also the manpower. It was a smaller number of firms, less manpower. The issues were very different, and I think that was recognized. So they gave us that flexibility to pursue the issues that we thought were most meaningful in the region.
Okay. What was your day-to-day like at the beginning when you're kind of getting on the job training? And
when I walked in my first day, frankly, I was a little surprised. It was a diverse group. Back then on Wall Street, there weren't that many women, but there was only one woman in the whole group, which is it was about 15, 17 people. It was only one woman in the group, and I think she couldn't take some of the guys. So she corked herself off the back of the office. It was a big bullpen area. She sort of walled herself off. A lot of salty language, which is kind of the Wall Street world back then. It's just so different now. 40 years. I've seen things evolve over the years. And as I said before, a lot of the people, ex-Wall Street folks, there was probably about 3 to 5, recently hired folks in the group, and you can see that was sort of where we're moving and sort of into the future.
so we're talking about 1982, right?
Yeah, right, 82. Yeah, it's 81, 80, 82. Yeah, I just, for the record, I worked for 2 years and I left for a year. Because my background, I was an accountant. I couldn't get my experience to qualify at the SEC, so I had to go and work in public accounting for a year. So I went into work at, which was Ernst & Whitty at that time. Okay, so that was the first 2 years. And when I came back approximately a year later, it hadn't changed that dramatically.
Okay. Talk about the exam program. You talked about flexibility. How much direction was coming from the home office? How much was New York just doing on its own?
Yeah, from what I could tell, Ken, again, I wasn't a manager, but it seemed like a lot of decision making was done locally. Okay. The nature of the exams, that we had back then what was called the SECO program, which were firms that were registered only with the SEC. So we had to have coverage of those firms, which we did. They were generally smaller firms, but that would change over time. It would change because the SECO program was abolished, I think, in about the mid '80s, or early. I'm not sure the exact date, maybe 84, 85, but it was abolished, and the program sort of migrated to what was called more of an oversight program. But from what I could tell, a lot of decision making was being done locally. Obviously SECO firms had to be reviewed, but then in our region we had a lot of the large firms, clearing and carrying firms. There was a lot of potential risks there, so that was also part of what Marty, Tom, Cam, and others realized had to be covered as part of our exam work.
How about the industry in general? The broker, you talked about Seco and the transition there. How about the broker dealer industry in general? Was
Right.
it
There were a lot of broker dealers. I think now there's about 4,000. Back then, I believe there was like 6 or 7,000. And I think I came in a very good time because there was a lot of medium-sized firms that were self-clearing, and I was able to cut my teeth with exams on those firms, and you really get an understanding of how the industry worked. Clearance and settlement process, custody, the net capital rule. That was sort of my expertise when I was an exam, the financial responsibility rules. So it was wonderful. It gave with my education, interest in finance and accounting, and with the opportunity to sort of look at a physical record. Sometimes it was microfiche, but you'd have, as opposed to now, everything's sort of virtual, and it's a little more clumsy now. I guess for someone like myself in particular, less versed with technology than others, but it made things. It made things easier to learn because I've gone into some of the larger firms, probably not that long ago, probably within the last 10 years, and maybe I lost a step, but those exams are more difficult. They're more difficult. Or it's to sort of harness the records and sort of go through them and do comprehensive exam.
Did you do any of those Seco exams?
Yeah, we did a number of SECO exams. Went out with senior examiners, and yeah, they were pretty quick. Some of them will last just a couple of days. We look at net capital, some basic sales practice issues. We had a simple module, and that was sort of the guide that we used, Ken, and we'd go through them. But I remember some of the first exams I went out on. I was assigned to work with a senior examiner, and it was like I think he got 4 exams, and we were going to do them in a month, and we sort of whizzed our way through them. It was a good introduction. It didn't delve that deep on those firms. There wasn't really a lot of risk. Some of them, they weren't holding customer securities, and some of them were just selling like some small private placements, things of that nature. It wasn't like sort of sales practice abuse, but yeah, it was something that I did a fair amount of it in the early stages.
So in my research, I noticed that after the Seco program, there's this transition, and maybe even before it goes away, to what was called an oversight exam. And I think you used the term. Tell me
Right,
about the principle, what
right.
the concept was with the oversight exam.
Yeah, the oversight exams came into vogue probably after the SECO program was eliminated. And the nature of an oversight exam was to sort of examine 2 periods. One was the current period, when you go in there and you look more currently, and sure, you want to make sure the firm is financially viable and they're not committing significant sales practice violations. And the other aspect was going back to look at the same period that the self-regulatory organization reviewed. And that would be either the NASD or New York Stock Exchange General. There are other SROs as well, but those were the primary that we'd look at. So it's almost like 2 exams in one you'd be doing and checking out. Truth be told, we spent most of the time in the current period. That's what folks did. But then we did do the work in the oversight period as well. But if we found issues in the current period, obviously look a little more closer at those issues in the oversight period.
My understanding was the oversight exams involved a good deal of looking at the SROs themselves. Was that the case?
That's right. Well, one of the things that we did before we even went out and did an exam, we went to the SRO. We looked at their work papers just to see what they did. And frankly, the SROs did some good work, and would have been, as a young examiner, as a beneficiary, looking through some of that work, and that was educational. But that would give us a very good background in terms of the firm and what the SRO did. And even from looking at the SRO work papers, you get a sense of maybe whether the exam wasn't up to snuff. You sometimes get that feeling. But then you're right. We would look a fair amount. The oversight period. when they perform their work, that was part of the scope of exam, and we look at that.
Okay, but would you also, as a matter of course, would you also go to the broker dealer itself and look
Oh,
at
I'm
that?
sorry. Yes, we would actually go to the broker dealer. It'd be part of the exam because, again, remember what I mentioned. We'd look at the current period, and obviously look at the current period. You have to be on site at the broker dealer, and these exams are all on site too. The SRO portion, we'd actually go to the SRO to look at the work papers, to look at the physical work papers, and then we'd go, we'd actually, go to the broker dealers and look at the current and to the extent we needed to spend as much time as possible on that oversight period.
Okay, so we're talking about oversight exams. You might have cause exams, right? If you get
They were always cause exams. The program was always cause driven to an extent, and even the oversight exams, we had the benefit of a lot of intelligence. We would get focus reports in, so we'd see the financial condition of the firms. We'd just get the annual reports, but you get a sense from that, whether the firms are in financial difficulty. So that was helpful. But we'd also get periodic dumps of the SRO reports. So the SRO reports were very helpful. And then under Marty, we had the complaint department, and the complaint area could be a very fertile source of issues to examine in the broker-dealer world. So, we were beneficiary of that sort of intelligence. So, that would help drive, the cause exams, and even to the extent, some of the oversight exams, even though there were oversight, there'd be some sort of, not all, but there'd be a rationale on a fair amount of them.
Okay. The other thing was there were cyclical exams. These were particularly big back in the earlier days. Did you have something
no,
like that?
I think with
number
us,
would come up?
Ken, I think in the broker-dealer side, there were less cyclical exams. I think with the investment management exam program, that was more common. Okay, because remember, we had the benefit of the SROs, and the SROs were really doing a lot of those cyclical exams. We were doing, it was the oversight. That was one of the major responsibilities we had, and it still is. Even to this day, it still is. That was a big part of our responsibility. But then because we had the SROs, it did free us up to look at some sort of find cause rationales for doing firms. And one of the big issues that the financial responsibility rules were relatively new back then. I think the net capital rule when I first started was about 8 years old. The customer protection rule was about 5, 6 years old, and those are just such important rules. And back then, the institutions weren't like we have today, so well capitalized. Especially these medium-sized firms, they were very thinly capitalized, and sometimes there were abuse on the customer protection side.
So were those the two things you were focused on the most? Net capital and customer protection?
Back then, in my career, probably for the first 7 or 8 years, I did a lot of work on the net capital and the customer protection rule. We also had responsibility for sales practice. I did some work in that area, but in particular, and Marty was a big driver of this. We did a lot of examination work related to Rule 15C33 and the customer protection rule, which is 2 aspects. One is the customer reserve formula, which deals with funds, and essentially, the idea there is to make sure that customer funds are used only if, to the extent they're on deposit to broker-dealer, used only to finance customer-related activities. And possession control, where we had a lot of good cases related to just maintaining possession or control, securities in a free, lien-free location at the broker-dealer or DTC had some sort of custodian. And this way, the customers are protected if things start to go wrong at the broker-dealer. We spent a lot of time.
You mentioned focus reports. Those were, I guess, those were obligation for every broker dealer. Tell me what that was.
Yeah, focus report is basically it's basically an audit report. Be submitted by an order of broker dealers' year of activity. The income statement, balance sheet, net capital computation, extent to we're a clearing firm. There'd be some sort of commentary on possession control, and they have a reserve formula calculation. So there was a lot of good information in those reports. Broker dealers was required to file an annual one audited, and then there were also other requirements that we didn't get. The SROs got the monthly and quarterly reports, but later on we'd get the benefit of seeing that information. It wasn't like during those days, but later on we get the benefit of seeing the information. But it was a good lead, you know, and it helped with the integrity within the industry. Obviously, to have auditors going through the records of the broker dealers, I think that was there was a real plus that we had on the broker dealer side. There's a lot of oversight, as you can see, within the SROs. You have the auditors doing that annual report, and then we're in there overseeing kind of everyone, not necessarily the auditors per se, you know, that wasn't our responsibility, but yeah, the information is helpful, and obviously they're doing their due diligence as they do their audit.
This has been great getting some nuts and bolts of the broker-dealer program. Let's talk about some things particular to New York. You were involved in some early work, Kidder Peabody, that turned into an enforcement case, right?
Yes, yes. Kidder Peabody is probably one of the first enforcement-related cases that I worked on. And it was kind of interesting because it was sort of a new issue. They were engaging in something we had never seen before. It was something called a hold in custody repurchase agreement, where you know they would not necessarily deliver out collateral to a counterparty, which is sort of common these days. You know, it's more typical, but they would set it aside internally, you know, for the benefit of the client who's providing the money, you know, for the financing of the repurchase agreement. And what we found is that, you know, to the extent that they were pledging securities, they should be available customer securities, meaning like in a margin account and freely available to pledge, or firm securities. What we found is that the firm was very sloppy, and they were pledging a lot of customer fully paid and excess margin securities, which weren't securities that should have been pledged. And as a result, it was probably one of our first, you know, big possession control cases. There were some issues with the reserve formula because they weren't capturing that pledge in the reserve formula. So it was a real interesting case. And I worked side by side. You know, the senior examiner was an interesting fellow named Romolo Catalano. He came from the industry, and is a guy who worked his way up. You know, came from Italy as a teenager. He worked his way through business school and became a partner in a small firm. Then eventually came to the SEC, and he was great. You know, he knew the back office and accounting so well, and I was able to learn so much from him. And he was great during, you know, he was the driver on that one. You know, and he just helped identify the issues. And Rommel would do, interesting guy, would sort of always make it a little personal. You know, so he'd get really engaged on some issues. You know.
Where did the case come from? Did the SRO tip you off, or
No, that one, you know, I always take pride in matters that we would find cold during the examination, meaning that we went in there and we were going to look at various issues because, you know, customer protection was just so important. So we looked in depth at that, and we found that cold. And a number of the significant enforcement cases that we brought, especially through, you know, through probably early 2000s, resulted from staff just finding good issues, what I would call cold, you know, just coming across it. Not all of them, obviously, and then the intelligence would get better and better. You know, on the sales practice side, we had the benefit of the intelligence from the customer complaint area, and Marty seized on that. Marty, one of the brilliant things about Marty Kupperberg is he was an energetic, creative guy. He was a little bit mad, I think, at some points in time. He's still a personal friend, but perception of Marty, I love him. But he harnessed that customer complaint area, and it became a great source of cases, you know, for cases and exam issues. You know, he was one of the first ones to realize the value of that area.
Okay, customer complaint, that's just kind of like tips, right?
Yeah. Customers. Yeah. We actually had a couple of folks sitting in. There would be a room, and they'd be responding to phone calls, and there'd be written complaints coming in. So it would be our responsibility to go through that and respond, you know, to those complaints. And sometimes you'd get very, very good information, you know, from those complaints.
You mentioned Romulo Catalano, right? Marty Kupperberg. Any other people that you worked with back during those years that made an impression?
Oh yeah, there were. I mentioned Tom Cam. You know, Perry Scopoletti is terrific. He was an exam manager for a while. You know, real smart guy. You know, Alan Wallace. You know, really great colleague and very knowledgeable, excellent writer. really, some really fine people. Um, and, it just, it was a pleasure to work with the group. One thing I will say, Ken, throughout my career, I was just, it was just a pleasure to work with the folks. For the most part, I had one or two, especially as a manager, wars with people, but most of the people were just the best. Really, we somehow hired some of the finest people, and a little different than private industry. People, there's no backbiting or stuff like that. I've heard like some of the lawyers come in from outside and they say, couldn't take it out there anymore. It's just, this is a happier place, and it is. And you're wearing a white hat, and you're doing the right thing, protecting customers and protecting the integrity of the market. And you have people who want to do it, and so it was just great.
The people on the ground in the regions had an interesting situation because you're working, under market reg, for example, but you're also working under a regional administrator. How did you how much did that actually impact things, sort of having
Yeah.
masters?
Over my years, because that continued throughout my career, and I basically led the program or co-led the program for about 28 years, which is a long time. Um, the regional directors gave us a lot of flexibility. I think they realized that we sort of knew what we're doing. I think that was part of it. And the other part is I think most of the regional directors had more of an interest in the enforcement side of the program, which, if you look at an office like New York, when I first started, it was 150 people. About 35 people were in the exam program. The rest were basically in enforcement. They had some administrative people, and they had some other people in corp finance, but the majority of the work was enforcement. So they spent a lot of time, with the enforcement folks. And uh, you know, over time, they got more involved. Like in later years, they got more involved with the exam program because it became more prominent as it became OC and became division. But a lot of times they relied on us and working with market reg and later OC.
Okay. How about your relationships with the SRO, the stock exchange,
The SROs, it was an interesting situation because respected a lot of people. Had some very good examiners, and as I said before, one of our responsibilities is commenting on their work, and that could sometimes be difficult. We'd have meetings with them, and basically say you missed this, you missed that, and no one likes to be told that. Firms didn't like it, SROs didn't like it, and frankly, we would miss stuff too, and we would particularly like it in hearing that. So that we had that responsibility. However, we also would sometimes work very closely with them. When we had an issue at a firm, it wasn't unusual for us to be on site with the SRO. So working side by side, and we'd be calling one another, sharing intelligence. So it was I would call a very complex, sometimes conflicted relationship, where sometimes you're responsible for overseeing them. Next week you're working side by side in the trenches with them. So it's kind of it's a strange relationship. That eventually resolved itself when Physio Group was created in OC. I think in 2000 and in 2010 or 11, something like that. It was.
Yeah. Physio is relatively recent.
Yeah.
How did that resolve things?
Well, what happened there is that if we found issues that we thought maybe the SRO may have missed, we would refer to Physio, and Physio would actually open up an exam and do the work to see if the SRO missed the violation. So it wasn't our responsibility. We would just make referrals and possibilities, and sometimes we just didn't know, or it looked like they may have missed it, but they were charged with doing the examination of the SRO.
Okay, all right. Well, stepping back into the earlier part of your career, late 80s, early 90s, there's some penny stock, micro cap things going on. It looks to me like exams were pulled in sort of into a concerted effort with enforcement. Do you remember that period?
Oh yeah. It was probably from as you said, late 80s, probably through like the mid to late 90s. The micro cap penny stock market was on fire. There'd be these boiler rooms out in Long Island, New Jersey. They'd hire kids, they were cold calling. It was kind of tragic. I remember speaking to some investors because I was involved in some of the exams. Like one woman, she was in tears. She couldn't control herself, lost her life savings. Some reason, they would pick on people in the Midwest too. I think the people in the Midwest are very respectful. They would pick up the phone and listen to these guys, and these guys would sell the moon to you. And sometimes they were public companies. Other times they were thin air. These are just total shell companies. And I say public and in the least sense of the word. Let's say that.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of abuse. It was. This is sort of before the internet, so a lot of the high pressure was coming through. The phone calls, and we did what we could. We went out and did exams of these. And Stratton Oakmont was one of the big ones. I wasn't personally involved in that, but we spent years fighting with Stratton Oakmont, and there were many others, and several that we helped probably put out of business. But they would come, they would pop up again too. Sometimes you would close a firm, and then a lot of people would become a branch of another firm, so you'd have to track that down. So it took a lot of resources, plenty of resources.
Did you work closely with enforcement on cases like that?
Yeah, eventually, I think because of a program like this, because there were so many cases coming at us, eventually Marty was able to form a group called Broker Dealer Enforcement. So he actually hired a bunch of attorneys to work on these types of cases. The broker dealer, and some of the possession of control net capital cases were being worked by these guys as well. But he hired a bunch of attorneys, and boy, he would whip these guys. I'm telling you, he would drive them, and they were very very effective group though. They got a lot of cases done. And eventually the world started to spread. He was doing insider trading cases, investment cases. He's running his own second New York enforcement program, but he was very, very successful in that, and what he did. But and I had the opportunity to work closely with a number of those attorneys, and they were some who went on to the industry, became high-level compliance officers, or partners in law firms. Very good people. It was a great time. It was a fun time, and we're trying to do what we could do, but we're sort of outmanned a bit. But we did what we could.
How long did that go on, Marty Kupferberg's broker dealer enforcement?
I think it went on for about 5 years or so. Yeah, and Marty, he took the lead with that. Marty, he loved the enforcement cases, and he was just so driven in the enforcement area. He liked the exams too. But eventually, Marty was the associate director. I was promoted, so we're both associate directors, and that occurred, I think, in '92. And we shared responsibility for the exam program. But I was sort of more involved the day-to-day of the exam program, and he'd oversee what I was doing. Sometimes insult me because I wasn't doing enough. That was just Marty's nature. And then he still insults me when I call him. But then he really got heavily involved in the enforcement program, and as I said, he had an ability to find cases. And it was the complaint area. It was some of the exam referrals, but he would find really good cases, and he got a lot of results done. So it was probably about 5 years, and it did close down. And it was probably rightfully closed down when Marty eventually left. He went on to an SRO, a nice job. And it was decided that Bob May wasn't the right person to run this program. It was probably a good decision. It was made by, I think, Parman Lawrence, and so that part of the program went back into enforcement. The unfortunate thing about that, and I think we all realize that, is when it was part of your group, it was easier to get the cases done. You sort of, you have Marty there beating these people up, literally. Where's that case? Where's that case? So they would get those cases. And when the cases go into the general pool, they would get, and enforcement was very good to us. We had a good relationship with general enforcement, but it still wasn't like having the attorneys as part of your group. So in my mind, it's probably a little less effective.
Interesting. Something called the Voluntary On-Site Inquiry Program.
Yeah. This came out of all the abuse we saw in the penny stock microcap space. A few folks, Steve Vinilano, Terry Bohan, Ed Janowski, came up with this idea. What we realized, we're getting complaints in, and it's from these entities, and we're looking at registered broker dealers, and we're realizing, well, wait a second, this isn't a registered broker dealer. It's an entity that's totally unregistered. So obviously, if you're selling securities, you have to be registered. So they came up with the idea, well, why don't we just go out and visit these firms? We know the location. We can get a sense of maybe what's going on. But since they weren't registered, they had no obligation to cooperate with us. So what the folks did, they came up with this process where we'd go in, we'd get as much intelligence as we could from customers who are complaining or whatever resources we had, and we'd go in there and ask for voluntary cooperation, production of records, interviews, things of that nature. And this is a very effective tool. We got a number of really good cases out of this. These folks, they felt they were great salesmen. Some of them were. So I think they were willing to meet with us because I thought they could get over. They probably thought they could get over on us. They could tell us a story and we'd go away. And these guys, Vitellano, Bohan, and Janowski, these are some of the best fraud examiners we had. These guys were shrewd and they did a great job getting to the bottom of it. And others eventually became part of that program, but they were really the leaders. They did a great job with it. It was a very interesting, successful program, which eventually became part of the OC mission. It's still part of the NEP because occasionally you're going to have entities operating in an unregistered space, so it gives you an opportunity to sort of visit.
At this point, you'd been there for more than a decade. You're running the broker-dealer program, I guess, right, by the mid-90s. Talk about the challenges you faced at that point. You've got things like bringing people in, training, promotion. How did you deal with the people under you?
Yeah, at times it was challenging. I will say I had a good group of assistant directors, who were very, very helpful, and good management staff. But we had to bring people in, get them trained. There was training offered by DC. I recognized that we needed some internal training, so we had sessions basically once a month where we would do training on various topics, topical issues. We'd have folks from either the staff present or people from outside, so that would be helpful. The management, other than times, you occasionally have an employee that wasn't doing what they should be doing. But most people, the vast majority, were trying to do the right thing. So it wasn't that difficult. Did it sometimes get stressful? I don't have much hair left. No, it did. I think especially after Marty left in the early years, it sort of, it took a little while to find my way. But I had an assistant director like Doris Bamford. She was brilliant. She was great. And others who stepped in, Rich Heafy. Rich Heafy for years, he was my right-hand man. He did a great job. Shouldering a lot of responsibility. John Nee, these folks were just terrific, and they really they helped. And they all became a little specialized in different areas. Like a Steve Vitellano became assistant director. He became a specialist in the microcap fraud area. He did a lot of his work there. And someone like John Nee was doing a lot of large firm work. So we became somewhat specialized, not probably as much specialized as we should have been. But we were resource limited also. But these folks were, they knew the mission and they were trying to do the job as best we could.
You get to an important point, I think, that in the early days, examiners were examiners. You got to look at everything, right?
Yes, yeah, that's generally it. You're right. You'd have this big checklist, and sort of you have to look at fidelity bond. You look at the registrations, but you're right. We especially when OC came into play, we started to migrate to more selective examination work, which I think we're still doing oversight exams, but we became a little bit more cause oriented and a little bit more focused on what we looked at.
Okay. Anything else we should talk about from those early days that we haven't touched on?
Not really. The only thing is, as I said before, it was just a very interesting time. I think I was fortunate to come in when the industry was still at a point where you could sort of get your hands around a firm, even a reasonably complex firm. And the staff, the folks who brought me along, I'm very thankful to someone like Marty, Romolo, Perry. These are really helpful folks throughout my career.
Okay. When did you first learn about OC, that they were going to do this thing out of the home office?
I just heard it. It was sort of announced. I didn't get any pre-notice. I heard about this, and lo and behold, OC was created. Lori Richards was the head. I really didn't know Lori. I knew she had an enforcement background. Um, but lo and behold, Lori turned out to be a great, she was a great director, and we had just throughout the years an excellent relationship with her. But it was kind of a little bit of a surprise, but it did make sense. As I said before, the exam program was kind of a backwater in market reg. So to get them out of market reg and ultimately to be an office and now a division, I think that makes it made tremendous sense, and I was happy to see that occurred.
How did it change the day to day? How did it change?
Initially, it wasn't a huge change for us. It wasn't. But I think over time, things did change. Um, what happened is there was more of an emphasis on sweeps. Sweeps became, very common practice, and touch on different issues. And microcap were one of the issues, but day trading, online trading, investment management had their own sweeps. So that helped us become more of a national program, because the sweeps were sort of, most of them, not all, sometimes we'd have local sweeps, were sort of national efforts. I think there was recognition too that there had to be more information provided to the examiners. So we would have, like, the order programs like called modules. So there was more of an emphasis on creating modules, which were very helpful, and some of them are just excellent tools. For looking at like something like day trading or looking at online trading. I know in New York helped create a bunch of those modules, so that was also part of it. And there was an effort, to be more of a national program. You just there's more of an outreach by Lori. There was more. There's more touch points over. Not a bit early on, but over the years it became much more common with dealing, sometimes jointly doing exams with folks from Washington or other regions. So it became more of a joint and national program.
Did Washington ever sort of take an exam or say, this is very interesting, we're gonna study this and get back?
They may have done that, and I didn't know about it. But I will say Lori in particular was very generous with us, and she gave us some great leads over the years. I'm sure they did take some matters that where they got a complaint down in Washington, or they heard some intelligence. Some of that, I think one of the things is all the work that was done on the specialists. That was done in OC. Frankly, I think that's where it belonged, though, because that's where they had the trading expertise. So I was never, because we had looked at some of the specialist activity, and frankly, we found a couple issues, but we didn't find like the problems that ultimately surfaced at the New York Stock Exchange. And the folks in DC put that together and did a really good job. But Lori, I remember she handed me a complaint or a tip that came in regarding Credit Suisse, alleging these high commissions being paid by those folks who are getting participations in hot IPOs. If you remember the late 90s, early 2000s, the tech boom was a super hot IPO market. The stocks would sometimes go 50%, even double the first day. And I guess this person saw that some hedge funds were paying these enormous commissions in relation to maybe getting those allocations of hot IPOs. And Lori provided that to us. She could have easily have kept it, in OC, but she gave it to us and sent a team out there. And they saw these high commissions almost immediately. Ron Suku was the lead examiner on that. He found it almost immediately, and we put together what was an incredible case. The enforcement folks did a great job bringing that. And I think overall it was a joint matter with FINRA, I think, but overall it was like $100 million fine on that one. And essentially what we found is that to get those allocations, you had to kick back in the form of these excessive commissions. And they could be, the commission rates back then was 6 cents a share. That was common, but some of these were $2, $3 a share. They were paying Credit Suisse on trades that were like done the same day or the next day. the sort of give them back like 35 to 65% of that first day pop. So which was just pay them back, and which is totally illegal. And sort of we were able to crush that, thankfully. But so I didn't feel that that we were being short shifted in any way. We had a lot of issues in New York too.
Yeah. In the Credit Suisse case, for example, how long would exams be working on that before you'd go to enforcement?
It would depend. That one, we gathered a whole bunch of information on the trades where we deemed to be excessive commission trades, and we handed off to enforcement team. They did the large part of the investigation there. Enforcement, we saw this. We saw there was abusive practice, and we sort of referred it pretty quickly. So that I don't recall the specific time, but I don't think it was more than 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We worked on that one and moved it over. Okay. But enforcement, not like that. They sensed this thing was outrageous, especially hot IPO allocations. I believe Wayne Carlin, who was the regional director, was personally involved in that one, and they had a great team on it. They did a really nice job.
Some of the things that came started when OC started, things like there were smart exams or surveillance exams. The exam program was changing somewhat. Did that affect you? Is that the new modules you were?
Yeah, I think it probably affected, the smart exams probably affected the investment management program more than the BD program, because I think we had always done these cause exams and used whatever intelligence we had. We had the benefit of the SRO, whereas the investment management program didn't have an they don't have an SRO, and now they have 13,000 registered advisors. They should have an SRO, but that's another point. But
Okay.
yeah, so I think that the impact there in terms of smart exams was probably more on that side, because I guess we always felt we were using whatever intelligence we had to do smart exams. Surveillance exams are a little bit different. That sort of that became like a new sort of oversight exam approach where we could look at the current period and see what was going on. Just emphasize the current period in sort of like a quasi oversight exam. And if we found an issue, we would go back and look at what the SRO was doing. So it was slightly different than a typical oversight exam.
Okay. So, but it is an oversight exam.
In a sense, it is. Yeah. But you're looking that clearly the emphasis is more on the current period. The oversight is ideally you're looking heavily at both periods. Okay, that's the ideal. Okay, for an oversight exam.
Now you've mentioned sweeps, and that's something that OC was really focused on in the first few years. Talk about being involved in one of these things. They tend to be national initiatives.
Yeah, they were national. I think some of the ideas would filter up from the exam staff and various regions, but they tended to be, I think, focused on really good issues and be driven to look on a very limited basis at what those issues were. And I thought it was a great use of resources. It helped build a national program. We weren't in the early stages. We weren't doing as much reporting out, but eventually that would occur from the sweeps when we start doing reporting out, as an exam function, what our findings were. But as a result of these, we'd have like some internal reports. I remember one sweep that I was personally involved with, which was the risk management sweep, which I led. Lori sort of put me in charge of that. We had a task force involved and a whole bunch of folks from both Chicago office and New York office, because they were mostly involved in like the larger firm issues. Looked at risk management practices across the industry, see what the auditors were doing, seeing what the SROs were doing. But we thought this was a really important issue, risk management, because it involved liquidity at firms, market risk management, credit risk management, which were really key issues. And some of that covered by various rules. You get charges in the net capital rule as a result of mishandling credit. But as the Drexel debacle showed, that if you don't manage your liquidity well, you highly depend on short-term credit, such as commercial paper, you can have a run on the institution. So that became much more of a focus, even though it wasn't necessarily rules-based type review. We developed a lot of of good documentation. I thought it was a tremendous module. Eventually grew to over 100 pages. It's still in use now, from what I believe, and just a lot of good work there. But these are yeah, I like the sweeps. Did sometimes we go a little sweep crazy? Yeah, maybe we did. Because there was a lot of sweeps at points in time. But I think there was a really good use of resources, just as long as we had the flexibility to cover the issues that we needed to cover in the region. And we, frankly, I felt we did. I didn't feel like I had to do 14 sweep exams and I couldn't cover this, this sales practice fraud. So it was fine as far as I was concerned.
If you led this risk management sweep,
Right.
did you work with people across the country and the other
It was
regional?
primarily with folks in Chicago. There were some involved. Yeah, those type of issues, because we had the largest firms, big in terms of capitalization, customer protection issues. So it was primarily us, and really we took the lead. And I was happy to work with both John Nee and Rich Heafy, who really did a great job. They helped. I sort of led it, but they were the ones who were writing up uh, the module and putting together a lot of the material. But it was fascinating because we got to. I feel we were really ahead of the curve on this issue, because the bank regulators really weren't focused on this at this time. And then you go to the accounting firms and even the SROs. It wasn't really part of the issues they were looking at. And it wasn't a rule-based review, but these were such important issues. If firms were ignoring market risk, credit risk, God knows where you'd wind up being. So it served to put firms on notice. And this is one of the first times that I think a sweep resulted in some sort of a public notice. At that time, OC didn't put out notices. It wasn't something that occurred. So what we did is we worked jointly, and the SROs were involved. FINRA, the NASD, and New York Stock Exchange were somewhat involved with this, but we worked together and put out a joint statement on what we think. So some of the weaknesses were in risk management practices and some of the good practices we saw.
Something that another case that arose around this time, first interregional advisors.
Oh yeah, First Institute was an interesting matter. I think this was probably the late '90s, but it was a firm that was basically selling municipal leases to customers. It was sort of a white shoe firm, and they had a great business. It's sort of like a municipal bond. It's like a quasi municipal bond. Just that instead of having a municipal bond, you had some sort of an interest flow that was secured by a municipal lease. And I remember that things were going well, but then all of a sudden, the examiner's computer disappeared, which was, that's kind of interesting. But they got us one right away. The computer was stolen, and that was rare. To have a computer stolen. How it was stolen, we thought it was in a secure location, but it was stolen. So that was sort of a red flag. And I remember going in for one meeting with the CEO, and the guy was so smooth, talking about how the business is very similar to GE Capital. They were in the same program, and eventually came up with some issues, but nothing that significant. However, we figured, we didn't always confirm transactions, but this is a different type of business. Why don't we send out confirmations to investors? We sent out a series of confirmations to investors, and one investor came back saying, well, you have 5 municipal leases that I own, but I actually own 8. Where are the other 3? And we had no idea the other 3. So we went back, and lo and behold, the other 3 were on a separate blotter. So what the firm was doing, they were selling the same lease to various customers. Sometimes they'd sell it 2, 3, 4 times. And it was basically a Ponzi scheme. So quickly after that contact, we went to enforcement, got contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. There was an FBI raid on the firm, and the place was closed down almost immediately. That was a great one. People faced significant jail time as a result of that. But one of the things I'd just like to mention about this particular one, and it gives you a sense of some of the difficulty the examiners face in doing their job, is that there was that one customer. We sent out conference about 15, 20 customers. There was that one customer who called us. Some customers, they don't respond. They don't, they don't care. This one customer, pointed out, and we pulled that thread, and we came up with the finding that, that there's something wrong here. We could have easily sent it to, a different customer who didn't didn't complain, and we may not have found that. So that's the risk you have as an examiner. I will say, sitting in this chair now, and I said it when I sat in my associate director chair, you're never going to find everything. And thankfully we found that. But people sometimes don't understand how you could miss something, and that could have easily been missed by the best examiner, is my point.
You say you go to enforcement. This may be a simplistic question, but what do you do? Do you have to fill out a lot of forms and
Oh, no. We'd usually put together an enforcement referral memo, but something like this would be an immediate conversation. You would just go into the regional director's office. I'm not sure if it was Carmen, Wayne. I'm not sure who the regional director was at that time, but I would just go in there and explain the situation. And this looks like a real fraud, and they would get people involved immediately. And this would happen a lot with the microcap fraud or some of the frauds that came out of those voluntary inquiries. They would almost, we saw fraud, they would jump on it immediately. Sometimes these guys would work would work overnight just to get the papers together, because they'd have to go for TRO. And this is like one of those type of matters. So they were very responsive. It depended upon the matter. It was more of a technical case. It would result in a memo, and that may take a little more time to get it through the system. Okay.
So were you in the World Trade Center in the late 90s?
Oh God, yeah. That was a real debacle. During 9/11. Was actually, in our building. It was a 7 World Trade Center, and I was actually talking to my wife when the first plane hit, and I look out my window and I thought it was a bus coming off the side of the building. I'm saying, what's that? And everything shook and rattled, and all of a sudden we realized there's something wrong here. So we basically all went running, to the center of the office space. We called everyone who was in the office to just sort of gather around and start to leave the building. We had to walk down. I think we're on the 11th to 12th floor at the time. So we had to walk down. Unfortunately, we couldn't exit the building right away because they weren't sure where, with the debris falling, whether the building was going to fall. So we had to wait in the upper lobby for an extended period, but then we left in the back of the building. But that was one of the more scary moments of my career, because when I got home, we had examiners who were actually working in the towers. So I was charged with calling everyone. I accounted for everyone with the exception of one examiner. And this was the last call I made. And she was working, I think, like the 45th floor of the North Tower. And when she picked up the phone, it was such a sigh of relief that, she was okay. And later on, I learned, and she sounded fine. She sounded like there was no issue. Her name was Florida. She's terrific. She now runs the program with Mike in New York, like But
Who's that?
Lourdes Caballas. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And she runs the program in New York with Mike Ruffino now. I was so relieved, and she sounded like nothing happened. And then later I learned that she was actually she had to run down the stairs. She was exiting the building, and it collapsed as she was exiting the building. She was covered with the powder, and she was the most well-adjusted person you can ever meet. It's amazing. And she's ready to go back and do an exam the next day. She was just like that. She had a type of resilient personality. Not everyone was like that. But it took us, the thing that folks should know, it took us quite a while to sort of regroup. It took us about 6 to 8 weeks to get back into the office. OC was very helpful, gave us a lot of materials, gave us more supplies. But it wasn't like it is now. Like, we're talking on this Zoom conference, and back then I was fighting my wife in the internet pickup, because we only had one line. She was mad I was home, So it was a difficult, 6 to 8 weeks. The Federal Reserve was helpful. They gave us space, and we worked, we had a couple of meetings there, but it took us a while to regroup. And then eventually did in the Woolworth building, and which wasn't the greatest space. And eventually we moved to the World Financial Center, which was a wonderful space. It was a great space. But it was a frightening time. And thankfully, we didn't lose anyone, because Lourdes in particular was the one that really got me. I was so happy that she came through it unscathed.
Wow. Did you actually have to put your work papers back together, reconstruct things?
Yeah, we had some exams, we basically, everything was gone and we made a decision, like some we probably, I think we canceled a few exams because we weren't finding anything and there were, it probably wasn't worth, recreating, that particular animal. But others, yeah, we had to sort of, we had to go back and sort of redo whatever we could, because, to the extent we did have electronic records, they weren't really centralized away from the office. They weren't on backup servers. They were on your computer. A lot of computers were lost. And we still are dealing a lot with paper documents. So there was a lot of cleanup work. It took us a while to regroup. It was a difficult period.
Another difficult period, maybe less for exams than for people in the industry, is the 2008 market break.
The market break was that was another climatic point in my career. Obviously, we had Bear Stearns go under, and then months later we had Lehman go under, and Lehman was a trigger for a lot of concern, and volatility and risk was just huge. After that, we sensed that, and we heard through some of our contacts that some of the firms were experiencing runs on them in terms of either margin calls, customers, especially hedge funds with flighty money. Hedge fund money is very flighty. They were demanding their money back. And so what we decided is to go visit a couple of majors. We went on site, opened up exams. We were concerned about the potential misuse of customer securities, in particular, or customer funds, to meet proprietary margin calls or things of that nature. But what got me when we were there is just the fear that we saw in the eyes of the folks that we dealt with over many years. This is the most frightened I've ever saw these folks, and I always tell folks that. I think we were probably just a few days away from another depression. I think if some of those major firms had gone down, which was quite likely because they were getting huge calls, you're talking about billions of dollars that have to be removed, customer reserve formula, where's the funding going to come from? It was a question mark, and obviously the derivative contracts, the margin calls on that were huge. It was a real problem. Thankfully, the Fed did step in and sort of make them Fed members, and some of the majors, and then I think really it helped stabilize the situation, but it was a frightful period, and I don't think folks realize how close we really were at that point. Folks who really study history should recognize that that the Lehman matter in particular, I guess people felt it had to go, but it really set off and at AIG, and it was just a debacle, in terms of the industry. Thankfully, they've regrouped, and there's been a lot of positive things that have resulted since then in the industry, capitalization and liquidity in particular.
You talked about how you sent examiners in to look at some specific things in the aftermath of Lehman. How did that?
It was not. Not necessarily with Lehman, well, it was after Lehman, but we went to other firms.
Right.
Yeah.
How did that? So that's one very short-term thing. In the long term, how did that trauma affect the exam program? Did you change the way you looked at firms in any way?
Well, eventually, what happened is, with the large firms, they became part of they were, I think even before that, they were on like an examination cycle, and the risk management procedures were generally emphasized. We would spend more time looking at larger firms and some of the issues, and there was probably a lot more coordination than there had been in the past with the federal bank regulators. I think also the market reg became very concerned with what happened with the big institutions. So they got a group together to start look at some of the institutions, monitor them more closely. OC eventually formed a monitoring group as well. So there were like essentially almost like two monitoring groups looking at various issues on the business as well as some of the risk management issues occurring at those firms. So there was a lot more oversight, and we were doing quite a few exams of the firms prior, but that probably intensified after that. And then one of the things that happened, I think Carlo DeFlorio recognized this. Maybe we didn't have enough of an in with some of the top executives of some of the firms. So he organized periodic meetings, annual meetings with various CEOs and risk managers and business people. So we'd get more of a connection with the individual. So if something like this happened again, maybe we would have, I think hopefully it won't, we'd have a earlier knowledge of the situation, and we'd be in a better position to sort of have contact points where we get really good information. So there was a fair amount of change. But probably the monitoring teams, the enhanced emphasis, on exams. We were doing exams. We maybe picked up the speed a little bit, looking at issues, and market reg having a little bit more to do with the large firms, even from they call it monitoring, but they would look to do like quasi sweep exams of different issues. So there was a lot more intensive coverage, and the coordination with the bank regulators, I think, improved.
Market reg was doing something like sweep exams.
They were doing, they were like a sort of a monitoring team. Plus, they had folks that they don't really call them exams, but they're sort of like kind of exams.
Interesting. Ah.
What can I take? And this was not something that that struck Bob Sollazzo as particularly sensible, but that's what existed. They created a group. In fact, they took folks from my team to sort of staff that group. It's
interesting. So this is in the late 2000s.
This was after Lehman. So this was probably 2012, 2011, 2012.
Okay.
And not everyone came from my team, but a fair amount. And I lost some of my best large firm people. Tell me why, Ken. I'm still wondering. I still scratch my head. I would always yell at these guys, when are you coming back? So.
You mentioned
the thinking was that they'd be more attuned, because my folks, they would do a large firm, but then they'd do a sales practice exam. So these people would dedicate just large firm issues and really embedded in like the largest firm. So there was some sense to it, but it could have been easily handled out of OC. But that's another story. Right. The story, that's a war that sort of I didn't win. Again.
You mentioned cyclical exams. Are you at this point, were you still just kind of somebody's number would come up and you'd go and take a look because you haven't looked at it for 3 or 4 years?
The only firms where we really do cyclical exams were the larger firms. That was it. And then I was heavily involved with the assignment of exams. Any firm that was holding customer securities, customer monies, we try to visit like every 3 years or so. And sometimes even more frequent if an issue spiked up. It wasn't a hard cycle. The large firms, we had a hard cycle on for a while. Okay, and I think it may have even preceded the Lehman debacle, and the bear side. I think it may have preceded that, but it then became a little more sharpened and more intensive oversight after after the market break, the crash.
So you wouldn't wait 3 years, for example.
Well, for the large firms, the cycle was tighter too. For the biggest firms, it was generally every 2 years, but sometimes we'd be in those firms like 3 times. Like some of the foreign banks in particular, good customers can. So we'd be in, even though we had a cycle of 2 years, sometimes we'd have 3 open exams in 1 year. Okay, because the exams would be a little bit more focused, cause related. So we would hit issues, and sometimes the sweep exams would require us to go in and look at a part of one of those larger firms. So we would hit those as well, on a cause basis. But then overall, they'll look at some of the more general issues like risk management procedures and capital, things like that. Would at least every 2 years.
Okay. So we've been talking about some big landmark events, and obviously a really big one from OC's point of view and enforcement's point of view is the Madoff revelations.
Yes.
Talk about how your office dealt with sort of changed course, reinvented itself in the short term, right after the Madoff revelations came out, and then in the longer term.
Yeah, that's probably the most difficult point in my career. Probably the most difficult point in the New York office and maybe the SEC in the last, fortunately, 50 years. It was a very difficult period, but I think we recognized immediately that there was a need for sort of some change locally, and this was assisted to folks in OC. Lori was very helpful. We got specialists on board. We hired a couple of specialists, one in like derivative products, another in equity trading. That was very helpful. I think there was a realization too that we didn't have sufficient data. So we try to attempt to sort of mine data, and that area became a real national focus too. Even though we realized that, we tried to get as much data as we could, but it became more of an intense issue, and things sort of just had to tighten up in terms of the review process, in terms of who's out in the field. And that eventually became more formal. But obviously, you want to get the best talent out in the field, and sometimes the best talent are your managers, and not every manager would go out in the field. So it was more of an attempt to sort of get the managers out in the field, and that was sort of pushed nationally too. So it wasn't only a New York effort. So some of this was sort of pushing together, in one place. Personally, like even as an associate director, I would go out in the field. Not, in the later years was less so, but I always loved going out in the field because that's really when you learn the business and the issues. So some of the managers were very good going out in the field. Others, they became more comfortable, and they had a lot of workload. They were reviewing reports, giving direction, so they were a little more stuck sometimes in the office. So there was a push, obviously, to get the talent out into the field.
Yeah, so you kind of alluded to what were called SSEs, senior specialized examiners,
Right.
which happened quickly. Carlo DeFlorio comes in, and there's an effort to just kind of take things apart and rebuild. And I understand that the regions were heavily involved in that. Did you work in that?
Oh yeah, no. Carlo was, he did a good job. He came in a very difficult period of time. He had a lot of meetings. He's a great communicator, Carlo, and he basically tried to bring us, all the managers together, say that we have to reinvent ourselves. This is a problem that we have as a group, and we have to improve what we're doing. And as a result, project teams were formed, like small committees to deal with various issues in the exam program. One is like specialization. One is data capture, one is exam process, one is supervision. And there were these various lines formed where you'd have both managers and staff working in these different areas. And they'd meet periodically. This went on for probably 6 months to a year, Ken, where people would meet, try to find what has to be improved in different areas. And then eventually they each group would sort of, and it led by, I was involved like in the specialization group, and others were led by SOs and other managers. They'd come up with summaries of what they think the best practices in each area should be. And that was then presented to the executive committee, which is another committee that Carlo formed of like the senior managers. Not every senior manager, but the senior managers throughout the exam program, many senior managers throughout the exam program, and they would hear what was offered up, and then elect either to go along with some of the recommendations or decline. And then I remember the executive committee, I think, was very respectful to people. Some of the recommendations just couldn't do. It was like some of the matters where it was just too extreme and it just wasn't practical. So they were gracious, the executive committee, try to inform people why maybe that didn't make sense. But I would say a lot of what occurred, a lot of the changes that occurred came out of these project teams. One of the things is the Chicago office is largely responsible for this, and Pete Driscoll was a driver. They came out with like an exam platform too, which we didn't have before. Everything was sort of segregated, Excel spreadsheets, Word, but they sort of developed an exam platform that went nationally. I know I contributed to some of the tools that were used in there. Something called control sheets, which sort of came out of the New York exam program that we had used for years. But it was a real national effort to come up with this, and it took a while. I know our productivity in terms of exams went down because it was a sort of self-analysis, self-evaluation. So it took a while, and we did feel beaten up during that period. But we did what we could. I think at the end of the day, we came up with a much more structured organization, and structure brings good and bad, as you know. But I think a lot of it, the approval process, there's a they sort of one of the things that happened is there was in terms of staffing, there was an attempt to sort of reorganize the way managers worked. So previously we had branch chiefs in the exam program, and the branch chief title was changed from the exam manager. And the idea, as I said before, is they wanted to get folks more out into the field. So the idea was to get the exam managers out in the field more. So they didn't have any direct reports. Now all the direct reports go to the assistant directors, which the assistant directors weren't particularly happy about, believe me. But that was part of life as an assistant director. So that the idea was that them be out in the field more, and that worked. And some of the exam managers were out in the field quite a bit. Others, you really got to push them out. But that became part of the change. Also, one of the things that came out staffing wise is the creation of what's called a lead examiner position. The lead examiner is sort of a senior examiner on the exam who sort of coordinates the work for the exam manager, make sure that the different elements of the work are being completed, and then everything's flowing in to get a report, like a central report, which is then submitted to the exam manager. So it's sort of a quasi supervisor, but it wasn't really. They didn't really have supervisor responsibility. It was kind of a weird position, but that's the way it was. I've worked with senior examiners when I was an auditor, and even in my role at the SEC. So you respect them, then more knowledgeable, and you listen to them. But even though it's not a direct supervisory role per se, so there's a lot of good things that came out of it. But again, it was more structured, and things became a little tighter, which good and bad with that.
How long did it feel like you were in this kind of upheaval? Was it a matter of years? Was it a couple of years? Was it months?
We in New York office, because that's sort of where Madoff took place. The impact was probably the greatest. I would say it was probably about, for us, maybe 12 to 18 months. And I think others would probably report differently. I think other offices were impacted less severely. We're impacted more severely as a result of that. But I think it took a while. It took a while, and it was stressful. And there's an inspector general review, and it was another shoe dropping here, there, and everywhere. So it was always like something we had to deal with. So it took a while, and it was difficult. It was a difficult period.
Things that came in with the new national exam program,
Right.
Risk alerts. You were involved in some of those.
Right. What I mentioned, previously, we did that risk management alert. We really didn't have the ability to put something out from OC, but the risk alert idea really came out of Carlo working with Julius Lyman Carbia. So we were responsible. The broker deal program was responsible for putting out the first risk alert, which is on master sub-account arrangements. And this is something that Julius really pushed. It was a good issue. The master sub-account arrangement, it's something that shouldn't exist. It's basically a limited liability account. So it's a master account, and there's a whole bunch of other accounts that are like separate customers essentially reporting up to it. So they have like different accounts at the broker dealers, but like sub accounts, not necessarily main accounts. So the master account is the account. But as a result, some of these were unregistered broker dealers because they're receiving commissions. Some of them were committing sales practice fraud. There's AML issues, excessive margin. So there were a lot of issues there, a lot of good things. And some of these firms were prosecuted, based upon the unregistered broker dealer. I think excessive day trading issues. There were a number of things. And FINRA, NAC, I know, prosecuted a number as well. So it was a really good first step in terms of a risk alert and getting information out there. And this is something that for OC, I think it was a big step. And Julius was the type of guy who wanted to sort of make a point, of an issue and want to make it prominent. And it was probably a good way to get it started. It was a good issue. Carlo was supportive of it. Sometimes within the commission it would take a while to get something like that done, but it was done. It was clearly something from the exam staff. The commission wasn't giving it stamp of approval necessarily. This is the exam staff putting this out and spotting issues.
Okay. Things that came up later in after this transition. There was a Latour trading case you were involved in.
Oh yeah, Latour, very interesting matter. You have to understand, Ken, that probably third to a half of my life, the SEC is involved in looking at net capital and the customer protection role. That was even as a manager. It's just such a large part of my life. And we were involved in some of the largest customer protection cases, but this is the largest in terms of fine net capital cases. And it was a great exam team. They did some really good work. Uh, Tammy Hella, Ashok Ginde, with two individuals on this one. Tammy's now out in LA. Ashok works for Physio. They did some great work on this. This is a situation where it's a high frequency trading firm. They're making a lot of money, and basically a lot of the activity was sort of arbitrage activity between baskets and underlying. And what happened is for the net capital rule, you get a beneficial treatment if you have a hedge that's allowed by the net capital rule. Sometimes they wouldn't have sufficient underlying securities to make the hedge. So what they brilliantly did, and it's interesting, I've never seen this before, they would just create a position. They'd say, well, economically, it's going to be flat because we don't create a long position, a short position. So they needed the long position to go into the basket. They put that into the basket, very beneficial treatment for the basket, save a lot in terms of haircuts and net capital deductions. And then the short position, they would just take a regular haircut on. But you just can't create positions out of thin air, and that's what these people were doing. And the staff figured it out. Much to their credit, it took us a while to sort of get everyone on board. It was an interesting matter, but the great enforcement team on that case too. They did a great job. But I'm sort of happy, given the amount of my time during my career spent on net capital, that this case is as prominent as it is.
And this was a high frequency trading firm. Did you use a specialized expertise?
We did. We had I think we had one of the specialists on that as well. But a lot of this was some of the folks we had. People like they were brilliant, these examiners. Tammy, she had some sort of Ivy League background. She was a CPA. She was she's a super smart person, and Shok too. A lot of it came from the exams there, but a lot of then there was to sort of back it up. We got the specialists involved, and they did help out. Yeah. But a lot of it was found that in that case it was found because we weren't looking at the trading as much per se as looking at the underlying, like the capital implications at that point. So that was like the exam team. We knew the capital issues better than the specialists really.
Was there a good bit of turnover in the New York office?
Yeah, I have a 40-year career in the New York office. Okay, so what happened is my early years there was a lot of turnover because the pay wasn't really that great compared to what you could earn in the industry, and enforcement was always it was a huge issue. Like I remember enforcement, especially during the 90s, it seemed like people would stay sometimes for a year or two and they'd just migrate out. The exam side was always less of an issue, but still there was an issue, especially as we're hiring young people. A lot of young people aren't going to stay at one place their whole career. So there was a fair amount of turnover. Then I think it was 99. Pay parity came into effect, so we then paid as much as the bank regulars. And I remember folks getting, myself included, got very nice raises. So it really helped with our lifestyle. I think it made a much more livable wage, for folks, even in the New York area. So that helped. After that, turnover did subside, although there was still turnover. And there's a lot of movement within the agency too. It's sort of encouraged to an extent. So people move from group to group. As I said, I lost some folks to trading and markets, and I still wonder when they're coming back. But the enforcement has probably always been more turnover than the exam side. Okay, because I think this is my view. I think the attorneys a lot of times could move into partnership roles, and really the amount of increase in salaries by multiples of what they're earning at the SEC. I think the examiners, some of the examiners left them very well. but I don't think the opportunities are as great. That's my own view, and I think a lot of the examiners are very happy with the work too. They really enjoy it, and so I think that it's historically been less, and in the last few years it's been even less. Like when since I left, since like there's no change almost.
Were
But
you able to get some senior examiners after the recession?
um, yeah, we did. That's when we hired a number of the specialists. We hired some specialists, and then it's a good point, Ken, because what we started doing, so, at one point we were hiring folks right out of school. That was like in the '90s, and these are folks who were more flighty. But then it was recognition. This was probably something that came out of uh, after the credit crisis. Um, it was recognition that there's a lot of talent out there. In addition to the specialists, we could hire people from the industry who are not necessarily specialists but have good backgrounds. So we hired folks from the SROs. We hired folks from the industry. Not really hiring direct people out of college anymore. In fact, we would have interns in the program, and oftentimes they were good, but we wouldn't hire them directly. They would go sometimes to work in the industry, SRO, and many a time we'd hire them after 2, 3 years if we felt they were a good fit.
Okay, staying on personnel matters. One of the big things that happened, we talked about the IAIC program a little bit, but the whole decision, I think Mark Wyatt made the decision that we've really got to beef up the program, and we're going to have to take people from the broker-dealer program. Did that affect your office?
Oh yeah, it affected us dramatically. That was another sort of unhappy moment in the Bob Sollazzo world. Because I will go on the record with this. So we lost positions, and it was unfortunate that we lost positions, but we were promised that we were going to get 6 slots, and at some reason when it was time to get those slots, Mark Wyatt reneged on that, and I will never forget that. And I was bitter, and Mark knew it, and we never really saw eye to eye after that. Believe me. But you can't. We have an important program. You can't just take people out of every broker deal program is different, and in New York is particularly important. And taking people out, you hurt our program, you hurt the morale, you promise us slots, and then the time comes, you don't show up at the slots. I thought that was kind of horrific, and I was so done in the dark of night, and I didn't appreciate that at all.
As far as morale, is this because the people who are left are having to work harder?
Well, I think in terms of morale, the people in the broker deal program saw that we were losing resources and to another program, and was some of that justified? I could understand it because with the absence of an SRO, some of it is probably justified, and I do get it. But be upfront with what you're telling me. Just tell me, this is what it's going to be. I remember ultimately, complaining to the chairman and to try to temper me down. But it was just not the right thing to do. It was just a really unfortunate thing. But people felt, that we're being picked apart. And we have I think over the years we had a very strong program. I think it was recognized both in the industry as well as the SROs, and the good relationship with enforcement. And to have that happen like that, we eventually got some slots, and I think when I left, we had one time where about 100 people. I think it was 101. I think when I left, we were like 87 or 88. So we did lose in that transition mode. We lost about 10, 15 people, whatever it is. But then we sort of stabilized, and we did get some. And I think we got a couple new slots recently. So it's stabilized. But that was that was a sore moment. Yeah.
Okay, but it wasn't a drastic. I mean, from the numbers you're talking about, it wasn't like this huge collapse or anything.
No, it wasn't a huge collapse. It wasn't. And the program went on. But from a morale standpoint, it looked like, here, the broker-dealer program's being picked on, you're not as important. That's how folks viewed it. And we're, right or wrong, and maybe we were wrong because I realized there's a real need in the investment management side. We're upset about it. And what really got me is the fact that you weren't being upfront with what you were going to do.
You mentioned physio earlier, and that's what comes in here, and it's sort of like oversight Mark II. Is that correct? Is that essentially the same kind of thing that you'd
No,
been doing?
physio, there were slots, folks did move into physio, but I understand the need for that, the idea is once the program was restructured and there was resources taken out of the broker-dealer program, the idea is they didn't want to lose any focus on the SROs, so that's why that was created. And also, some of the regions were complaining about the conflict that existed, where you're working sometimes hand in hand with these folks, and other times you have to criticize their work. And I think that was also part of it. So the attempt was, to maintain a focus on the SROs. I think that was a primary reason, and also to eliminate that conflicted relationship, because this way, that's their responsibility. We're, if we're working, and I'm telling you, we worked a lot, especially with, with something like during, the COVID. I was there for the first few months of COVID. We're working, and this is even in some of the other issues that existed. We were working arm in arm, with colleagues in FINRA, and so it probably did make sense to make that move.
Okay. My understanding of physio was essentially it was to be an oversight
Yeah,
organization.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically oversight of the SROs. That's their primary function. And I think, that was a primary function. Yes.
Okay. Is there anything that from your career that stands out that we haven't talked about?
I don't think so. I just want to express the feeling that I feel blessed to have been able to work. It's like 38 years, and with the agency, it's a premier agency in the federal government. I mentioned the SEC to someone I worked there, in a hiking group that I'm in, and said, "Oh, well, that's like the best federal agency." It's we had a rough spot, back in 2010, 2011, with Madoff, but gets a lot of respect, well-deserved respect. Quality people, just incredible. I just want to reemphasize that, and just such a lot of talent I work with, enforcement and throughout the regions. So really, really good folks. So I think you covered the major bases, in terms of my background and career, and hopefully shed some light on some of the practices that existed, and hopefully people find this interesting.
Well, I certainly have. It's taught me a lot that I needed to know about the broker-dealer program.
Good,
So
good.
I
If you have
really
any other questions, you can always ask.
all right. Thanks a lot.